Welcome to this new season of the lecture series of the Network for Ocean Worlds. This network has been formed by NASA to advance comparative studies to characterize the Earth and other ocean worlds across their interiors, oceans, and cryospheres. In particular, the studies investigate their habitability, the search for biosignatures, and try to understand life in such environments.
This is our third season. Specifically, the theme for this season is exploring ocean worlds through analogs. This particular episode is episode one of four, excuse me. And the previous two you can definitely check out online through YouTube. But for this particular episode, we're looking at modeling studies or numerical simulations. And we have two excellent speakers with us. Dimitris Menemenlis from the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory at Caltech, /Caltech, I should say. And he'll be talking about an introduction to climate models, oceans, and sea ice. And then we have Krista Soderlund from the University of Texas Institute of Geophysics, and she'll be presenting modeling the physical oceanography of ice-covered moons. And without further ado, we have our first presenter, Dimitris Menemenlis. As I mentioned, Dimitris is a research scientist at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He's also supervisor of the Ocean Circulation and Air-Sea Interaction Group. Today, he'll be talking about the estimating the circulation and climate of the ocean, also called ECHO, where Dimitris is a principal investigator and co-investigator in several studies that pertain to this particular ECHO project. And he'll be describing ECHO specifically, which aims to model, estimate, and predict global ocean circulation and its interactions with ice, biogeochemistry, and the atmosphere. And the tools developed by the ECHO project are starting to be applied for studies of planetary bodies. For example, the atmospheric circulation of Jupiter, and ice or sub-ice circulation of frozen ocean worlds like Europa. So without further ado, Dimitris, go ahead, and his talk is Introduction to Earth Ocean Climate Modeling, Estimation, and Prediction.
Okay, so when I give this lecture in person, I actually start by putting 2 glasses of water on the counter, room temperature water, put salt in one of them, and throw 2 ice cubes and ask the audience which ice cube will melt first. So if you want to give your answer on the Mentimeter or think about it, it's really cool to see how many people actually get the correct answer, and we'll come back to it. By the time I get back to it in the lecture, one of the ice cubes has melted and the other one hasn't, and it's a very interesting kind of reason if you haven't seen this experiment. I want to start with this picture. 100 years ago, last year actually, it was the anniversary of Weather Prediction by Numerical Process. That was an amazing book that was written by L.F. Richardson in 1922. And it kind of predicted numerical weather prediction before the existence of computers. It was kind of really amazing. He even gave an actual example where he carried out computations manually. And there was this, fanciful kind of description of a room full of calculators, which would be people that would be carrying out calculations with someone sitting in the middle there and requesting answers to these calculations so you can move forward a weather model. And there was one of the quotes in the beginning of the book: perhaps someday in the dim future, it will be possible to advance computations faster than the weather advances and at a cost less than the saving to mankind due to the information gain. But that is a dream. It's amazing how far we've come in 100 years. So I want to start with a few reasons why we develop numerical ocean models. There's many, many reasons, obviously, but just one of the reasons that we develop these models is because of anthropogenic impacts on climate. And this is a time series of observed temperature anomaly in the at the surface of the planet. And one of the things that we're worried about is that temperature is increasing because of the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, the ocean happens to absorb most of that increase. So if you were to look at the heating of the atmosphere here, that's due to this greenhouse gas, is this line here that you can barely see, and most of the extra heating has gone into the ocean, and that is why we can still live on our planet, is because the ocean has managed to absorb a lot of the damage that we have done by increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And basically, one way to think about it is that the ocean absorbs 7 Hiroshimas worth of heat every second. What's the cause for this anthropogenic heating? Well, it's the fact that we're pumping all the dinosaur carcasses and other stuff, that carbon that had been buried over millions of years. We're just burning it and putting it into the atmosphere in a very short amount of time. So this is the famous Mauna Loa time series with pre-Mauna Loa carbon estimates from ice cores. So in addition to absorbing most of the heat, most of the extra heat, the ocean is actually also the largest active reservoir of carbon. And what I mean by active, it's a reservoir that can respond on approximately a human lifetime, so 100 years. Obviously, there's a lot of carbon that's stored in rocks, but it is the timescales over which you access that carbon, for example, through erosion, is much longer than the lifetime of a person. So if you look at the ocean, it actually about 95% of the active carbon is stored in the ocean, which, if things were to remain the same, let's say steady state, linear, so most of the 95% of the carbon that we put in the atmosphere will end up in the ocean. But the question is, how long will it take for the ocean to respond to that? We know that to date, the ocean has absorbed about a third to a half of the anthropogenic carbon that we've put in the atmosphere. But figuring out how fast the ocean may continue to absorb atmospheric carbon dioxide, or perhaps stop absorbing it, is kind of critical to figuring out what the peak atmospheric carbon dioxide will be. So some motivation of why we want to have numerical models. And the other motivation is that the ocean system is an incredibly complex system. There is a zoo of strongly coupled physical ocean processes at all sorts of time and space scales. And yes, you can do some approximations, on paper, but really to put all these processes together and get to some sort of descriptive and predictive skill, you need numerical models. So without further ado, what are some of the components of an ocean general circulation models? Well, you have some equations that describe what fluid will do and how it will evolve in time based on a state at some point in time. Then you need to discretize the world, the oceans, in some fashion. That picture by Ella Richardson was some example of discretization. So there's different ways that you break up the globe into smaller regions in which you solve these equations of motions. And you have to do the same thing in the vertical, horizontally and then vertically. And there's many different ways that people have come up for discretizing in the vertical with various advantages and disadvantages. Now, the other thing you need is boundary conditions. You need to prescribe a shape of the basin that you're modeling, initial conditions for the prognostic variables. That means temperature, salinity, velocity, sea surface height, and sea ice if you have that. And then you need surface forcing fields, so atmospheric either fluxes or atmospheric state. You need river and glacier runoff, tidal forcing. And if you're not modeling the whole globe, then you also need lateral boundary conditions if you're going to go model a small region. So this is what a ocean model may look like after you put all these things together. So this is some of surface variables that we're actually able to observe from space. The first one, the one that's moving fast, is the zonal wind stress magnitude. So it's the winds driving, so atmospheric storms, if you like, and winds driving the surface of the ocean. The response of the ocean is at different timescales. It is smaller and slower than the atmospheric forcing. So here at the bottom left, you have the sea surface height anomaly, where you can see mesoscale eddies, for example, and currents. From space, we can also observe sea surface salinity, and we can observe sea surface temperature, which again operate at the time scales of the response of the ocean as opposed to the atmospheric forcing. So we can also do the same for sea ice. And I don't have time to go into detail, but there is touching the ocean is both frozen seawater, which is called sea ice, but also ice sheets, which is accumulating ice due to in regions where there is more snow precipitation than melting over a season. And the sea ice has a very large impact on climate because it insulates the ocean from the atmosphere, and because it changes the albedo. So there's some very nonlinear feedbacks due to the sea ice. We again have some equations that we can write about the behavior of sea ice. Here is an example of the type of equations that we would want to solve. And then when we put them all together, we can end up with some representation of the way that sea ice cover behaves, including cracks and melting and interaction with eddies. So one of the things about these models is that we can't represent everything. We have, for example, typically we may be able to run these models with horizontal grid cells that are a few kilometers, 25 kilometers, that would be a quarter of a degree simulation. Now we have higher resolution simulations, but no matter what you do, there's going to be oceanic processes that you cannot represent, right? What are you missing? So let's say you're trying to model the globe, then there is a zoo of interacting processes that you will not be able to resolve explicitly. So you have to come up with parametrizations for these processes. Just as one example, this is one specific parametrization that I was involved with, 10, 15 years ago, which we had we were having problem representing the upper halocline in the Arctic Ocean, which is this region where the warmer Atlantic water is isolated from the sea ice due to a stratification, a salinity stratification. So fresh, cold water on top of saltier, warm water, and you have the so-called halocline, which isolates and allows the ice to grow. If you had all this heat coming up to the surface, you would melt the sea ice very quickly. The reason for that is happened to be because if you try to model the interaction of the sea ice with the ocean beneath it, when the ice forms, it will reject some salt, and the salt will actually fall through the water column at scales that are much smaller than the ones than you can model. So let's say you're modeling, scales of a few kilometers or 20 kilometers, but while these plumes of salty water, when you form ice, they may be 100 meters or less. So you can't explicitly represent them. You have to come up with a parametrization, so an approximate representation of these processes. And once you do, you're actually able to solve this specific problem. So this blue line here is how we were able to represent stratification before the inclusion of this parametrization. So this is temperature, this is salt. So this is kind of the same type of issue that all the models, Arctic Ocean models, were having before this parametrization. And then once you add this parametrization of subgrid scale salt plumes, the green and the red line, you end up being able to follow the observations much better. The observations here are these dashed thick line, and also the individual observations, the thinner lines. So this is one example of a subgrid scale parametrization. Now we come to, I don't know if anybody had guessed correctly. The answer to that puzzle is that the glass with fresh water will melt the ice cube much faster than the glass with salt water. And the reason for that is it's an oceanographic. With the salt water, you end up having salt stratified profiles. So all the fresh water will stay at the surface. The fresh water will be cold, and therefore it will inhibit the ice cube from melting. On the other hand, in the fresh water glass, if you melt some of the ice cube, it's colder, it's heavier, it sinks to the bottom, brings some of that warm water up to the surface, and it would actually melt your ice cube much more quickly. So getting to echo, which is what Michelle mentioned, is we aim to combine observations and models. So if you have observations, let's say in situ observations, you can the strength of these observations is that they're the closest to ocean truth that you can get. You can actually touch the water and observe it, but they're very limited spatiotemporal coverage. Ships are expensive, floats, even the so-called Arrigo floats, there's only a few thousand of them, and the ocean is very vast. And there are point measurements in time and space, which are not necessarily representative of large-scale, long-period average, and they're contaminated by geophysical and instrument noise. And because of that, they will be alias when you're trying to represent large scales. The strengths and limitation of satellite observations is you get global coverage, but they're indirect observation of very limited number of oceanographic variables because you cannot penetrate the ocean with electromagnetic radiation. So they're limited to near surface or depth integrated observables. There's errors due to, for example, atmospheric variability and retrieval algorithms. And even though you can have global coverage, there's still sampling issues due, for example, to the footprint size and the fact that the sampling is episodic every time the satellite goes around the Earth. So observing the ocean just with observations is like blind man observing an elephant. Depending on what you see, you may think that it's a fan, a spear, a snake, a tree, a wall, or a rope. So how do you make sense of all these observations? Well, you use numerical models. The strength of a numerical model, it's a complete space-time description of the ocean, but it's an imperfect representation of truth. There is errors due to the discretization, there's errors due to the subgrid scale parametrizations, and of course, there's errors due to the initial and surface boundary conditions. So how can we get a description of global ocean circulation that is as complete and as close to truth as possible? We observe the ocean circulation with satellite in situ instruments. We construct numerical ocean models based on primitive equations and empirical parametrizations. And we use the observations to improve numerical ocean circulation model and to adjust empirical parametrizations and boundary conditions. We make practical and scientific predictions based on these models, and then repeat the loop. We acquire new observations to evaluate and further constrain the model predictions. This is what such a system might look like. This is what we do in ECHO. We have satellite observations, we have in situ observations, and we have very big computer models that allow us to put all these things together. Finally, very quickly, an example application. We started by talking about the impact of the increasing carbon in the atmosphere on the ocean, and the fact that the ocean has absorbed 30 to 50% of the anthropogenic carbon, and also the fact that assuming everything goes well, most of the carbon we put in the atmosphere will end up in the ocean, hopefully, eventually, but we want to know on what timescales and with what processes, so we can model the carbon cycle. We can again put all these things together, but including now in situ biogeochemical observations. And we can end up with estimates of what the ocean carbon cycle is doing compared with observations, describe what has been happening. So by having a model that's constrained with observations, we get kind of the best of both worlds. We can, unlike the models who are not constrained, we can follow the observations more closely. And unlike reconstructions that are based on observations only, we can explain how the carbon is absorbed in the ocean. And this is a picture of a budget that shows how carbon enters or exits the ocean for the top 100 meters and for the full depth. So because I'm running out of time, and I'm just going to give a summary. So components of an ocean general circulation model, there's equations of motions, conservation, state, horizontal, vertical, and time discretizations, initial, bottom, and surface boundary conditions. We saw similar for the components of a sea ice model. We need to parameterize processes that we cannot resolve explicitly, depending on what resolution we're using. And since models are not perfect, it's very advantageous to combine observations and models in order to get to the best possible description of what's happening. And very quickly, I showed you one example application that pertained to the specific motivation I showed at the beginning, which is how do you use these tools to build an ocean ecology and biogeochemistry model with predictive tools. So I want to finish by saying that the model that we have been using as part of the so-called ECHO project, which stands for Estimating Circulation and Climate of the Ocean, is the MIT GCM, Massachusetts Institute of Technology General Circulation Model. And this model is being applied to model planets and planetary bodies. And these are a couple of example application papers. For example, it's applied to model the oceans under ice in Europa, or to model the atmosphere of Jupiter. So I'm going to stop here and let the, I guess I don't know if the questions are now or if they're going to be at the end after the second presentation.
Thanks a lot, Dimitris. We will take a few questions now, and also, if people percolate, we'll also take sort of general questions at the end. So yes, please go to the Menti, and if you haven't already, and you can input questions there. I will try to moderate those. Let's see. So one question comes up is, which of the variables in the models are sort of currently least constrained by measurement and sort of contribute to uncertainty, or maybe, which variable do you wish there were more measurements of?
So one of the issues is satellite observations are fantastic, but they do not give us full depth description of what the ocean is doing. So we would love to know a little bit more what is happening within the ocean. If you were to use satellite, I think one potential additional observable would be to get some properties of the mixed layer, how deep it is, for example, and what its stratification. There are some ideas how one would go about it. In terms of other observables that would be helpful, again, from satellites, would be to get better estimates of fluxes, both of wind stress, surface currents. So there's a mission that's being proposed that would be able to do that. And in terms of better estimates of heat and freshwater flux, again, there's a mission that's being proposed. And in terms of what has just flown, and we're super excited to use, is the surface waters and ocean topography mission, the so-called SWOT, with some spectacular increase in the resolution of sea surface height. So yeah, so that's from satellite. Obviously, in terms of exploring the inside of the ocean, we have the Arrigo program, which is fantastic. It would be great if some of those floats were to go deeper than they are right now. They are restricted to 2-kilometer depth, most of them. So there's some, we would love to know what happens below 2 kilometers, especially in terms of how much of the heat that's absorbed by the ocean goes down there. And we'd also like to have a little bit more about the biogeochemistry. So there is the bioargo floats that are starting to be deployed that give us not just temperature, salinity, depth, but also some input about the biogeochemistry of the water. And finally, I have to mention something about when I started my PhD and also my postdoctoral studies. There were ideas of how to measure remotely the ocean at depth using acoustics. And I think this is a field that maybe was a bit ahead of its time when we tried to do it 30 years ago, but I think now there's some really cool ideas about how one could probe all these things we cannot see from satellites using acoustics.
Okay, thanks a lot. We'll take more questions now also at the end. So please do, again, go to Menti, put in the code, and as your questions sort of percolate through, add them in. Michelle?
So I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay, great, yeah. Michelle, do you want to go ahead and introduce our next speaker?
Definitely can.
Thank you.
And without further ado, I'll present the next speaker. We have Krista Soderlund, who is again from the University of Texas Institute for Geophysics, and she's a planetary scientist who focuses on planetary interiors and fluid dynamics, with particular interest in ocean worlds and magnetic fields across the solar system. In addition to using direct numerical simulations and terrestrial analogs, she is also co-investigator of the ice-penetrating radar instrument Rhoden on NASA's Europa Clipper mission. Dr. Soderlund will review different potential mechanisms that have been proposed to drive oceanic circulations in the Jovian and Saturn satellites, summarize recent advances in the literature, and highlight outstanding questions. Without further ado, Krista.
And I'll start off by apologizing that I haven't been able to get my camera to work today, so I won't be able to see you all or you see me. But I'm really delighted to be here today to be talking about modeling the ocean circulation within ocean worlds in the outer solar system. So just a brief outline of the presentation. It's going to largely be two parts. One will be to kind of give a really high-level overview of the different ways that you could drive ocean circulation in icy satellites. And then we'll go into some practical details about how you model rotating thermal convection in particular, and then give a case example of looking at some of the different modeling results from that type of work. And this first part you could find also in a recent review paper that several of us put together that kind of describes a lot of these driving processes that I'll go over. So the first parts that I wanted to start with were buoyancy-driven flows, and those are flows that are driven by temperature and compositional contrasts across the ocean. So there are a couple of different aspects to consider here. The first is that you're going to potentially drive fluid flows through basal heating of the ocean. So in that case, you're going to have warm fluid at the base of your ocean. It's going to be heated, so it's going to be less dense, and it's going to rise up towards the seafloor. Conversely, you could also have, say, salty fluids that are draining through the ice shell that then enter into the ocean from above, and then those are going to be denser potentially than the underlying ocean water, and then that could also drive currents from above. So those are destabilizing mechanisms. But you could also have stabilizing effects, and that could be, for example, if you have a melting of the ice shell and that is going to release fresh water into your system that is nominally less dense than the underlying ocean water. So then you're going to have this region of less dense water at the top, which will be more likely to stay put. And another aspect that really comes into play, especially for smaller satellites in the solar system, is that you could have a potential for a negative thermal expansion coefficient. And what that basically means is as your water gets warmer, it actually becomes more dense. So then you could have this scenario where at the top of the ocean where you have the lowest pressures, you could have this scenario where you have a layer of stable stratification that's just due to the salinity and pressure of those ocean worlds. So that's the stabilizing aspect. But then there's a third scenario where you could have competing gradients in salt and in temperature. In this case, you could have a process called double diffusion. And I'll just show like one figure from a recent paper by Wong et al. That shows double diffusion in action for Europa's ocean. So what you can basically see here on the left is the temperature, and on the right is the composition. And you can basically see that you have all of these different layers that create kind of like a staircase structure in this double diffusive scenario. So those were buoyancy-driven flows, but you also will have flows driven from mechanical forcing. So the one that you might think of most naturally are tides, because especially around giant planets, you could potentially have really strong flexing of the ice shell due to its being pulled as it goes around its host planet. So that deformation could lead to ocean flows. But then you could also have changes in the rotation rate that could lead to libration and precession. And then those can also act to essentially stir your fluid as well. And that's what's shown in this video of basically an experiment that's kind of sloshing back and forth in the rotating frame to create bulk filling turbulence in this case. And there are many different kind of flavors of flows due to these types of mechanical forcings. For example, on the top row on the left, you have this eccentricity tide. So that's basically going to be a direct tropic effect that's kind of uniform with depth. You could also have flows driven by the obliquity tide, and that's what's going to be shown on the right. On the bottom figure, this is going to have a slightly more complex set of governing equations, where this one is going to have three-dimensional effects rather than just the 2D, but it doesn't include aspects of inertia. And then when you add that level of complications in terms of nonlinear effects, you can get really unique bulk filling turbulence in the case on the right, which shows a libration simulation. So those are the different types of flows that you could get through this mechanical forcing. And there has been some theoretical work to look at what oceans might be susceptible to this type of librational instability. And in particular, it's worth noting that both Europa and Enceladus's oceans are in this potential instability region, but it's not suggested for Ganymede's ocean or Titan's ocean or Callisto's if it were to happen. So a new mechanism was proposed a few years ago that I don't think has an analog on in Earth oceanography, which is electromagnetic pumping. And this is the case where you basically have, especially in the Jovian system, where you have Jupiter's really strong magnetic field that's tilted by about 10 degrees compared to the satellites. So as the planet turns and the satellite goes around in its orbit, you're basically going to have this wave of magnetic fields that can then drive a fluid motion within the moons themselves. So there's been some modeling work that shows this. You can basically drive a retrograde jet in the ocean, and then that can be complemented by overturning circulations at the equator, and it can even generate a decent amount of heat relatively near the ice-ocean interface through this electromagnetic pumping mechanism. And one aspect of note is that this mechanism decreases as you go further away from the planet, and it also reduces as you have a more axisymmetric magnetic field of the host planet. So this is really going to be important for the Jovian system and Europa in particular. All right, so now I wanted to get into more of the modeling work that I do, and this is in a relatively recent GRL paper and some work that Daphne Lamasqueret has been working on, and I'll go into that now. But I wanted to start off by just kind of giving a overview of the governing equations. So this is a intentionally generic description of all of the different physics that we have to incorporate, at least in principle, into our simulations. So on the top is the conservation of momentum, and it has your temporal components. It has nonlinear inertia, Coriolis, pressure gradient, buoyancy, viscous diffusion, the Lorentz term due to the magnetic field, and then the Poincare due to variations in the rotation rate. And then you have all of these additional aspects like the conservation of mass, of tracers, thermodynamics, equation of state, etc. But that's not always very practical. So we want to make some simplifying assumptions. And the first ones that we can make is that it's non-magnetic and has a constant rotation rate. And additionally, we can assume that the fluid is incompressible, and we can consider a linear equation of state. And when we do that, we get a notably simpler system. And especially when you can rewrite that in terms of the advection and diffusion of heat and salt. So then all of the first and second thermodynamic laws simplify into these simple advection diffusion equations. So I generally take kind of a Occam's razor approach where we want to try to simplify and really understand processes in detail, kind of in as much detail as we can without bringing in additional physics until we initially understand the first set. So we're also going to make the first approximation of only looking at thermal buoyancy and not necessarily considering the effects of salinity to start off with. So then we're left with this set of governing equations. And then once you have those, you need to set your domain. And in this presentation, I'll be considering fully three-dimensional rotating spherical shells. But you can also do, for example, a box model. You also need to set your boundary and initial conditions, and I'll go into those a little bit more detail later. But then you also need to discuss your solution approach. So Dimitri had a really nice description of MIT GCM, and that takes this large eddy simulation approach. So what that basically means is there's a couple different ways that you can solve all of these equations, but they all have a unique aspect that you're not able to resolve all of the length and spatial scales and time scales that are relevant for the ocean. So you need to be able to accommodate that in some mechanism. So with these large eddy simulations, that's like the subgrid scale parameterization that he described. We take the alternative approach of direct numerical simulations. So that means that we do a solve of all of the length scales and spatial scales that we can for the given input parameters. So we're able to kind of resolve all of these different scales in the system. So that's what I've been focused on, but there is a cost to that, as you'll see shortly. So I use the open source pseudospectral code MAGIC, and this was initially developed in the early 1980s to study the solar dynamo, and then has been subsequently modified to look at the Earth's geodynamo, to look at the giant planet atmospheres, and then I've been using it to look at ocean worlds. So this is a non-dimensionalized code, and that means that we basically have three input parameters which are defined on the bottom here. We have the Rayleigh number, the Ekman number, and the Prandtl number. So Rayleigh is basically going to control how vigorously you're convecting. Ekman is the quantification of how strong the rotational force is, and then Prandtl is a consequence of the fluid properties. And then we have the boundary conditions to inform there as well. So we need to be able to have input parameters for these three different parameters for our input models. So here I'm just going to show you the Rayleigh number on the y-axis and the Ekman number on the x-axis, where stronger buoyancy is towards the top and faster rotation is towards the right. And we can make rough estimates of where the icy satellite oceans might lie on this graph. So that's what I've plotted up here in the upper right corner. But when we look at where all models fall, they're not even overlapping with the satellites. They're in the opposite corner on this graph. So then you're left with this pretty fundamental question of how do we relate all of these models to the planets? So one of the ways that you can do that is trying to use scaling laws. And to kind of illustrate that, I wanted to have a brief sidebar to talk about the influence of rotation, because that's one of the biggest aspects that comes into play here. So when you have really fast rotation, you're going to have quasi two-dimensional flows, as you see in the upper left corner for this columnar flows. And then as you have slower and slower rotation, you have this breakup of this two-dimensionality, and it eventually becomes this quasi-isotropic three-dimensional turbulence. And that's important because we're able to get scaling laws that then predict where you transition between these different types of flow structures. And that's what I've now added onto the plot on the right. So the yellow bar is going to be the transition between this geostrophic turbulence and the unbalanced boundary layers. And then this red region is going to be the transition between this unbalanced boundary layer and the non-rotating regime. And that has quite a bit of uncertainty, and that's what's denoted by the color. So there are a couple of different scaling laws that have been proposed. So with that in mind, we're able to try to set our input parameters to be computationally reasonable, but yet relevant to the icy satellites. So we have a suite of numerical models that are shown in the plot on the left. So we basically do a sweep in the Rayleigh number and we do a sweep in the Ekman number. And as I mentioned, the boundary conditions, we assume that they have no roughness, they're impenetrable and non-deformable. We also have the top boundary to be isothermal to match the melting temperature. And we have a uniform fixed heat flux on the bottom boundary. And we also assume that both boundaries are stress-free. That might not be the natural thought. You might think that no slip would be more appropriate. But because we're at these relatively high Ekman numbers and we have basically too much viscous forcing, we're trying to reduce that effective viscosity by having stress-free boundaries. And then I'm going to show a set of results from this kind of cyan model here. So this is just some of the results that I'm showing. On the left are zonal flows. So these are going to be east-west currents that develop in the ocean. So blue is going to be westward or retrograde, and then red is eastward or prograde. And then this is solved on every data point, every grid point in this three-dimensional domain. In the middle panel, we have the radial velocity at the mid-depth in the ocean, where red is upward and blue is downward. And then in the right panel is a video showing the evolution of temperatures near the ice ocean boundary. And this is all in dimensionless units. So those are going to be shown after all longitudes, but we can also do a longitudinal average, and that's what's shown in these printouts. So that kind of shows how the ocean behaves if you consider an average over all longitudes. And then for the velocities, those are given in dimensionless Rossby number units because the code outputs everything non-dimensionally. So next we can look at how the simulations vary depending on the relative role of rotations. So in this case that I just shown, we have that highlighted in the middle. So you have this retrograde equatorial jet, prograde high latitude jets, this upwelling of warm water at the equator, and that leads to a noticeable peak in heat flux at the ice-ocean interface at low latitudes. If you are going to have a weaker Coriolis force, then you're going to have a pretty similar trend in the next case. Oops, went the wrong way. But then as you continue to go towards the non-rotating regime, you get a different scenario where you no longer really feel this organization due to Coriolis and everything looks a bit less sensitive to the rotation direction. Conversely, if you then look at a stronger Coriolis force, you start to have more zonal jets. So in this case, you have you kind of switched your directions here. You do still have this equatorial upwelling, but you start to see a bit more axialization in that upwelling, and you have less of a dominance in heat flux at low latitudes. You start to have a larger contribution at the poles, and that's due to kind of direct pumping of warm water from the seafloor up to the ice-ocean interface. And that really continues as you continue to increase the Coriolis force, where you get multiple alternating jets. You can really see this axialization of the radial flows, and you get a pretty dramatic change in the heat flux profile, where you instead get a peak flux near the poles and a minimum at low latitudes. So that's all very good from the model's perspective. We can then bring this back to applying them to the icy satellites. And if you remember on the convective regime diagram, I showed that Europa, Ganymede, and Titan all really lie together in the similar area of parameter space. And it suggests that they all may be behaving dynamically similar if you consider thermal convection. There is some sensitivity in terms of what scaling law you consider, but these are our general predictions for what those different flows might look like. Conversely, Enceladus fell into a different part of the convective regime space, and that's noticeable because that suggests that Enceladus's ocean is predicted to have some degree of vertical stiffness. So you would instead suggest this like multiple alternating jets and peak heat flux at low latitudes. And with that, I just want to kind of summarize what we've talked about. And in general, I'd say the last 5-10 years has really seen a wonderful growth in planetary oceanography. So it's a really up and coming field. And there's really a lot of exciting dynamics that go on in these systems that kind of span turbulence, global scale and small scale structures. That's going to lead to really interesting consequences for heat and salt transfer and habitability, and how that could be suitable or not for potential biospheres. But I also want to highlight some of the limitations for icy satellites, because in my mind, this is an avenue for future work that I think really needs to be done. And so far in my talk, I've talked about like thermal convection, but that neglects really important salinity-driven circulations and also the phase change at the ice-ocean interface. And there's groups that have been doing a lot of nice work on that aspect. And you would also have, say, these melt and freeze distributions leading to variations in ice shelf thickness could then have both thermal and topographic feedback. So you would need to have that type of coupling incorporated into those models. And we also need to do more work, I think, on the electromagnetic pumping and how that can then interplay with some of these other processes that are going on as well. And besides just the Jovian magnetic field being a mechanism for driving flows, it's also interesting to note that the ocean currents themselves, they're going to be moving a salty water around. So that in itself could create an induced magnetic field just due to those ocean currents. So I think that being able to look at the electromagnetic signature of these ocean currents might be a way to do some hypothesis tests for different ocean circulations that have been proposed through the modeling with the future mission. And then since this was a modeling themed lecture series, I also want to comment about how complementary it is to kind of leverage the different types of numerical models. For example, these direct numerical simulations versus the large eddy simulations, and then relating that as well to theory, which is what we use to justify our parameter inputs, and additionally laboratory experiments, which are largely what's been used to derive these convective regimes, and then also terrestrial analogs where we can get some ground truth to see how these different types of aspects all interplay together in a actual real world scenario. And so with that, I would be very happy to answer any questions through the Menti, and as well, you can send me an email. I'd be more than happy to discuss any of this and more. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Krista. Yeah, let me pull up the Menti. Okay, so question about how do the different temperature and gradient flow forcing scenarios get mapped to different potential ice thickness scenarios at Europa. So I think maybe this is pointing at, yeah, sort of, with Europa Clipper coming up, if we were able to get at those different ice thicknesses, how will that help constrain these models?
Sure, let me make sure I understood the question. So it's thinking about how if you were able to measure, say, the distribution of ice shelf thicknesses with Europa Clipper, how would that then come back to refine different ocean hypotheses, like as a test?
Yes, I think that's the gist of the question. Yep.
Okay, yeah, so that work has been started in the Saturnian system, where there has been estimates of what the ice shell topography for Titan and Enceladus is. Then you could map out how that leads to a distribution of heat flux at the ice-ocean interface, which then you can use to test different ocean models. So that, I think, is another really important way to be able to test our models, and I'm really looking forward to doing that with Europa Clipper. We have started looking at that a little bit. Like, I'll kind of take the liberty of showing some recent work once I can eventually scroll there, where we have coupled our ocean circulation model to a very simple ice shell model on top. And then by doing that, we're able to look at different configurations of what the ice shell might look like. So we're heading in that direction to couple into ice shell thickness estimates as well.
Cool, thanks. All right, let's see what else we have here. Okay, so I think clarifications. The models, they don't work in the same regime as the bodies of interest because of computational limitations. I guess you need the scaling laws because of computational limitations. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, so the relevant length scales for like planetary fluid dynamics in general could be anywhere from millimeters, depending if you're looking about molecular scales, to meters and a few kilometers if you're looking at like the smallest type of like eddy scales. And no models are going to be able to do that. So you need to make some type of you have to work around that somehow. So you can either parameterize it, or you can try to use these scaling laws to pick out that you're going to be able to capture the relevant physics that you're missing in those scales. So it's kind of different ways to incorporate that. You can't model that really no matter what you do.
Great, thank you. All right. I think we are almost out of questions. As I have the liberty of having a microphone, I'll just ask one. So I'm, Dimitri, I'm curious what you think planetary scientists should be paying attention to as they start to grow this nascent field of planetary oceanography and doing the models.
Oh my God, that's an open-ended question. I don't have a comment. I think just looking at the publications that, there's a lot of experience that has grown out of modeling the Earth. So I think paying attention to the experience that has come out modeling the Earth might be helpful. I noticed that Joe Pedlowski has his hand up. Maybe we should listen for that question.
I will see if in theory, I should have the capability of allowing him to ask a question via his microphone. Let's see. Give it a try.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I noticed, first of all, thank you very much for the very interesting talk. I noticed that in all of the calculations, the setup was very much like the Earth system. That is to say, very large horizontal scales of motion, very small vertical scales of motion, the motion squeezed into kind of narrow shells. And that's kind of crucial for the dynamics on the Earth system, allowing us to make the hydrostatic approximation, for example. If you were talking about gaseous planets where the vertical scale and the horizontal scale were not substantially different, the physics would be really quite different without the hydrostatic approximation. Have you given any thought to that possibility and the kind of physics that would arise in those situations?
So I think that's another question for me.
Yeah, I can I guess comment on that a bit. So in the simulations that we've been doing, they don't assume the hydrostatic approximation. It comes into the equations, but it basically comes out of the first order balance. So all of the dynamics that we have and the pressure term in the equations that we solve is the non-hydrostatic pressure. So the non-hydrostatic effects, I think, are really significant in ocean worlds, in addition to giant planet atmospheres and the geodynamo, if that's helpful.
But it does look as if your vertical scale is much less than the horizontal scale.
In the length scales, that is generally true, but the velocities are quite strong in the vertical direction. So I think that kind of offsets some of the length scale arguments.